The house lights dimmed at the Grand Ole Opry on November 9th, 1973, and Johnny Cash walked onto that sacred stage wearing his trademark black. 2,200 people filled every seat, their applause washing over him like a wave. But Cash barely heard it. His mind was somewhere else entirely, locked on a letter that had arrived at his manager's office 3 days earlier. The letter was handwritten on lined notebook paper, the kind a child might use for homework. The ink was blue, and in places it had run where tears had fallen. It was from a woman named Margaret Sullivan, from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and it began with 5 words that had haunted Cash ever since he read them. "You helped bury my boy." Cash had been performing for nearly 20 years by then. He had sung in prisons, in churches, on national television. He had received thousands of letters from fans, from inmates, from people who said his music saved their lives. But this one was different. This one made his hands shake when he held it. Margaret's son, Specialist 4 Timothy James Sullivan, had been killed in Vietnam on August 14th, 1973. He was 19 years old. According to his mother's letter, Timothy had carried a photograph in his wallet throughout his entire deployment. Not of a girlfriend, not of his family. It was a picture of Johnny Cash, cut from a magazine, with lyrics to "I Walk the Line" written on the back in Timothy's own hand. When Timothy's personal effects were returned to his family, that photograph was among them, along with a request he had written and sealed in an envelope marked, "If I don't come home." The request was simple. He wanted to be buried with those lyrics in his pocket. He wanted Johnny Cash's words to go into the ground with him. Margaret Sullivan's letter didn't ask for anything. She didn't want money or a phone call or an autograph. She simply wanted Cash to know that his words had mattered to her son, that in the jungle, far from home, scared and lonely, Timothy would whisper those lyrics to himself like a prayer, the words about keeping true, about walking a line, about being faithful. They had become Timothy's anchor in the chaos of war. But here was the part that broke Cash's heart into pieces. Margaret had included a photograph with her letter. It showed Timothy's funeral at Arlington National Cemetery, and there, folded into the boy's uniform pocket, visible just above the flag draped across his chest, was that magazine clipping with Cash's words written on it. A 19-year-old soldier had been laid to rest with song lyrics as his final companion. Cash had read the letter alone in his tour bus, and for the first time in months he had wept. Not the quiet tears he sometimes shed late at night, but deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere ancient inside him. He had served in the Air Force himself back in the early 50s. He knew what it meant to be far from home, to be scared, to reach for something, anything, that reminded you of who you were before the uniform. His manager, Lou Robin, had found him there an hour later, the letter still clutched in his hands. "What do you want to do?" Lou had asked gently. Cash had looked up, his eyes red. "I need to meet her. I need to meet this mother." Lou had made the calls. Margaret Sullivan lived just 140 miles from Nashville. She had never been to the Grand Ole Opry, had never seen Cash perform live. Her husband had died in a factory accident when Timothy was just 12, and she had raised the boy alone, working double shifts as a nurse to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. When Lou called her and explained that Johnny Cash wanted to meet her, there had been silence on the line for so long that Lou thought the connection had dropped. Then in a voice barely above a whisper she had said, "Why would he want to meet someone like me?" "Because your son mattered to him," Lou had answered. "Because what you wrote mattered to him." Now, standing on the Opry stage, Cash finished his opening number and set his guitar on its stand. The audience clapped, whistled, called out for their favorites. But Cash raised his hand, and the room fell silent. The man in black commanded that kind of respect. "Folks, I need to tell you something tonight," he said, his deep voice carrying to the back row without amplification. "I need to tell you about a young man I never met, but who I think about every single day." He could see confusion rippling through the crowd. This wasn't how his shows usually went. Cash was a performer, a showman. He told jokes, sang songs, kept things moving. but tonight was different. His name was Timothy Sullivan, Cash continued, and he was 19 years old when he died in Vietnam 3 months ago. His mama told me that he used to carry my picture with him, with some lyrics I wrote on the back. And when they buried him, those words went into the ground with him. The Opry was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop on that wooden stage. 2,200 people held their collective breath. Now, I've been making music for a long time, Cash said, his voice starting to break. I've been blessed beyond measure. I've played for presidents and prisoners, for rich folks and poor folks, but I'll tell you something true. I never really understood the weight of words until I got Margaret Sullivan's letter. I never really understood that what we say, what we sing, what we put out into the world, it doesn't just disappear into the air. It lands somewhere. It lands in someone's heart. He paused, looked down at his boots, gathered himself. When he looked back up, his eyes were glistening in the stage lights. Margaret Sullivan is here tonight. She's sitting right there in the 3rd row. Cash pointed, and every head in the building turned. Margaret was a small woman, maybe 50 years old, wearing a simple navy blue dress. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her face was frozen in an expression somewhere between disbelief and terror. "Ma'am, would you stand up for me?" Cash asked softly. Margaret didn't move at first. The woman next to her, June Carter Cash, Johnny's wife, who had helped arrange all of this, gently touched her arm. Margaret rose slowly, shakily, like someone who might collapse at any moment. The applause started small, just a few people in the front rows, but it built like a summer storm. Within seconds, all 2,200 people were on their feet, and the sound was deafening. They weren't applauding her presence at the show. They were applauding her sacrifice, her loss, her son. Margaret stood there, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by an outpouring of love from strangers who would never know her boy but honored him anyway. Cash let the moment stretch out, let the applause continue until it felt like the building itself might shake apart. Finally, he raised his hand again, and the crowd settled back into their seats. But Margaret remained standing, her legs visibly trembling. "Ma'am, I need you to know something," Cash said, and his voice was thick with emotion now, no longer the confident baritone of a country star, but something rawer, more human. "Your boy, Timothy, he didn't die for nothing. I know it might feel that way sometimes. I know the nights are probably long and the house is probably too quiet, and there's a chair at your dinner table that stays empty." Margaret's hand went to her mouth, and her shoulders started to shake with sobs. But Timothy mattered. His life mattered, and the fact that he found something in my words that helped him, that comforted him, that gave him strength, that's the greatest honor anyone has ever given me. Not the gold records on my wall, not the awards, not the fame. Your son took my words with him all the way to the other side, and that means more to me than you will ever know. The Opry was full of crying people now. Grown men were wiping their eyes. Women were holding each other. Even the stagehands in the wings had stopped what they were doing to listen. Cash stepped away from the microphone, walked to the edge of the stage, and knelt down on one knee so he was at eye level with Margaret. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something wrapped in black cloth. "This is my grandfather's pocket watch," he said, loud enough for the front rows to hear, but speaking directly to her. "My mama gave it to me when I left for the Air Force. I carried it through my whole service. It kept me company when I was scared. It reminded me that time keeps moving, that I would get home eventually, that I was part of something bigger than myself." He unwrapped the watch, and it gleamed in the stage lights, gold and old and precious. "I want you to have this," Cash said. "I want you to have it because Timothy carried my words, and that means we're connected now, him and me. We're brothers in a way, and I want you to know that whenever you look at this watch, whenever you hold it, you remember that your boy's life had meaning, that he touched people he never met, that he made a difference." Margaret couldn't speak. She just shook her head, overwhelmed, trying to refuse the gift because it was too much, too precious, too valuable. But June Carter was beside her now, helping her down the aisle toward the stage, guiding her gently forward. When Margaret reached the front, Cash climbed down off the stage, something performers almost never did at the Opry. He stood before her, this legendary figure in black, and he took her hands in his, rough, calloused hands that had played 1,000,000 guitar chords, and he pressed that pocket watch into her palm. "You don't have to say anything," he whispered, but the Opry was so silent that people 10 rows back could hear him. "You don't have to thank me. I'm the one who should be thanking you. You raised a boy who knew how to hold on to hope. You raised a boy who knew how to be true. And that kind of raising, ma'am, that's the hardest work there is." Margaret collapsed into his arms then, this small woman and this tall man, and they stood there while she sobbed into his shoulder. Cash held her the way you'd hold someone who was breaking into pieces, firmly but gently, letting her know through his strength that she didn't have to be strong right now, that someone else could carry the weight for a moment. The audience didn't applaud. Somehow, they knew that applause would be wrong. Instead, they sat in reverent silence, bearing witness to something sacred, something that transcended entertainment or performance. This was grief and honor and love all tangled together, and it was holy. When Margaret finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and her eyes were swollen, but something had shifted in her expression. The absolute devastation that had been there when she stood up was still present, but now there was something else too, a flicker of comfort maybe, or recognition that her son's life had rippled out further than she had known. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. "Thank you for seeing him." Cash nodded, his own eyes wet. "He was worth seeing, ma'am. He was worth seeing." June helped Margaret back to her seat, and Cash climbed back onto the stage. He picked up his guitar, adjusted the strap, and stood at the microphone without saying anything for a long moment. The band behind him waited. The crowd waited. Everyone waited. "I'm going to sing something now," Cash finally said, "and I'm singing it for Timothy. But I'm also singing it for every boy who went over there and didn't come home, for every mother sitting at an empty table, for every father who can't look at his son's bedroom, for every brother and sister and sweetheart who's trying to figure out how to keep living when part of them died on a jungle floor halfway around the world." He started playing, a slow, mournful progression of chords that seemed to come from some deep place of pain. And then he began to sing. Not one of his hits, not something from the radio, but a song he had written in the tour bus 3 nights earlier after reading Margaret's letter. A song he had never performed for anyone. The lyrics were about a soldier far from home, about carrying memories like talismans, about promises made and kept even unto death. They were about a mother's love that spans any distance, even the distance between life and death. They were about words that matter, about music that heals, about the sacred duty we have to remember those who gave everything. Cash poured everything he had into that song, every ounce of grief he carried for his brother Jack, who had died when they were boys, every bit of guilt he felt about his own struggles, his own demons, his own failures. Every piece of gratitude he had for being given a gift with words that could reach into someone's darkness and offer light. When the song ended, the silence stretched out for 3 full seconds. Then the applause came, thunderous and sustained, and this time it went on for 5 full minutes. People were standing, crying, shouting, and Cash just stood there, his guitar hanging from his shoulder, looking at Margaret Sullivan in the 3rd row. She was smiling through her tears, clutching that pocket watch to her chest, and she mouthed 2 words to him: "Thank you." After the show, Cash invited Margaret backstage. The green room at the Opry was usually a circus, musicians and managers and hangers-on all jostling for attention. But tonight, Cash had asked everyone to give them privacy. It was just him, June, and Margaret, sitting on a worn leather couch with cups of coffee. Nobody was drinking. "Can you tell me about him?" Cash asked. "About Timothy? I want to know who he was." And Margaret talked. For 2 hours, she talked about her boy, about how he had been shy as a child, how he had loved building model airplanes, how he had taught himself guitar by listening to the radio, about how he had signed up for the army not because he wanted to go to war, but because he wanted to give his mother a better life with the signing bonus and the steady pay. She talked about his letters home, about how he tried to keep them light and funny even though she could read the fear between the lines. About the last letter she received, which arrived 3 weeks after the notification officers had come to her door, where Timothy had written that he was scared, but that he was trying to be brave, trying to be true, trying to walk a line between who he had been and who the war was making him become. "That's where your words mattered so much," Margaret said, looking directly at Cash. "You gave him language for what he was feeling. You gave him a way to understand his own heart." Cash listened to every word, and when she was done, he said, "I'm going to remember him. I'm going to think of Timothy every time I sing. And I promise you, ma'am, that his story won't end with me. I'm going to tell people about your boy. I'm going to make sure people know that words matter, that music matters, that every life matters." Margaret reached across the space between them and took Cash's hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong for such a small woman. "He loved you," she said simply. "Not as a fan loves a celebrity, but as someone who felt understood by you. That's a rare gift, Mr. Cash. Don't ever forget how powerful that is." They talked for another hour, sharing stories and tears and even some laughter when Margaret told funny stories about Timothy as a little boy. Eventually, exhausted and wrung out, Margaret said she needed to get home. She had a long drive ahead of her, and she had work the next morning. Life, as it always did, kept moving forward. Cash walked her to her car, an old Chevrolet that had seen better days. Before she got in, he hugged her one more time. "You call me if you need anything," he said. "Anything at all. You have my word." Margaret nodded, clutched the pocket watch one more time, and drove away into the Nashville night. Cash stood in the parking lot long after her taillights had disappeared, looking up at the stars. June came out to find him there 20 minutes later, standing in the cold November air without a jacket. "You okay?" she asked, slipping her arm through his. "No," Cash said honestly, "but I will be, and so will she, eventually. She's stronger than she knows." June squeezed his arm. "What you did tonight mattered, John. You know that, right?" Cash thought about it, about Timothy Sullivan carrying his picture into war, about Margaret Sullivan driving home alone with a pocket watch that had been handed down through generations, about the thousands of soldiers still over there who might be carrying pictures of their own, holding on to whatever scraps of home and normalcy they could find. "I hope so," he said quietly. "God, I hope so." In the years that followed, Cash kept his promise. He told Timothy's story in interviews, from stages in the foreword to his autobiography. He established a scholarship fund for children of fallen soldiers, naming it the Timothy Sullivan Memorial Scholarship. And every year on August 14th, he would call Margaret to check on her, to remind her that he remembered, that Timothy was not forgotten. Margaret lived another 32 years. When she died in 2005 at the age of 82, she was buried wearing that pocket watch on a chain around her neck. Her will specified that she wanted to be laid to rest at Arlington, in a plot near her son, and she wanted the watch to stay with her because it represented something precious, the connection between a soldier's sacrifice and an artist's words, between a mother's grief and the healing power of being seen, of being honored, of being remembered. At her funeral, Cash's daughter Roseanne sang one of her father's songs, not the new one he had written for Timothy, though that had become famous in its own right, recorded by dozens of artists and played at military memorials across the country. No, Roseanne sang the song that had started it all, the one about walking a line, about being true, about finding yourself alone when each day is through. And as she sang, a young soldier in dress uniform stood at attention by Margaret's casket, holding an American flag. He was 19 years old, the same age Timothy had been when he died. He didn't know the Sullivan family. He was simply there as an honor guard, doing his duty. But as Roseanne sang, tears began streaming down the young soldier's face. Because he understood, in that moment, what Timothy had understood all those years ago in a jungle on the other side of the world, that music can speak the things we cannot say, that words can carry us through impossible darkness, that art and life and love are all bound together in ways we barely comprehend. The story of Johnny Cash and Margaret Sullivan became legend in certain circles. People who heard it would shake their heads in wonder, marveling at the connection between a famous musician and an unknown soldier. But for those who were there that night at the Grand Ole Opry, who witnessed that moment of raw, unscripted humanity, the story meant something different. It meant that our lives touch each other in ways we never know, that the words we speak and the songs we sing can travel further than we can imagine, that grief, when honored, can transform into something bearable, that the distance between celebrity and ordinary citizen, between performer and audience, between the living and the dead, is sometimes no distance at all. Johnny Cash died on September 12, 2003, just 4 months after his beloved June. At his funeral, among the hundreds of famous and powerful people who came to pay their respects, there was a simple wreath of white flowers with a card that read, "From the Sullivan family. Your words mattered. Timothy's life mattered. You helped us remember. Thank you." The card was signed by Margaret's 3 daughters and 7 grandchildren, family members Timothy had never met, children born after his death, who nonetheless grew up hearing stories about their uncle who had carried a country singer's picture into war. And on the day Cash was buried at Hendersonville Memory Gardens, a young man nobody recognized stood at the back of the crowd of mourners. He wore an army uniform with a specialist rank insignia. He stood at attention throughout the service, never speaking, never approaching the family. When it was over, he placed something small on Cash's grave and walked away. It was a photograph of Johnny Cash, cut from a magazine, with handwritten words on the back. The words were different from the ones Timothy had chosen, from a different song, but they carried the same meaning. A soldier, far from home, holding on to hope through someone else's poetry. The photograph stayed there on the grave for 3 days before the groundskeepers carefully collected it. They didn't throw it away. Instead, they gave it to John Carter Cash, Johnny and June's son, who added it to the archives. Because that's what we do with sacred things. We preserve them, we honor them, we remember. And somewhere, maybe, Timothy Sullivan and Johnny Cash are together, talking about music and words and the mysterious ways that human hearts connect across time and space and even death. Maybe they're laughing about how a magazine clipping and a pocket watch became symbols of something larger than either of them. Maybe they're just sitting in comfortable silence, 2 men who never met in life, but who were bound together by the simple, profound power of words that mattered. The truth is, we don't know what happens after we die. We don't know if there's reunion or rest or anything at all. But we do know this: as long as we tell the stories, as long as we remember the names, as long as we honor the sacrifice and the art and the love, they're not really gone. Timothy Sullivan carried Johnny Cash's words into war and into death. Margaret Sullivan carried her grief for 3 decades, transformed bit by bit into something like peace. And Johnny Cash carried the weight of knowing that his words had mattered, really mattered to someone who needed them most. That's the story. That's what happened on November 9th, 1973, at the Grand Ole Opry. And in all the years that followed, it's a story about a soldier and a singer, about a mother and her grief, about words that heal and connections that transcend. It's a story about how we save each other, sometimes without even knowing it, just by being honest, by being true, by walking the line between who we are and who we hope to become. So if you take anything from this story, take this. Your words matter. Your life matters. The things you create and say and do, they ripple out further than you can see. And somewhere, someone you'll never meet might be carrying your words with them, holding on to them like a lifeline, letting them be the thing that helps them through one more day. That's what Timothy Sullivan taught us. That's what Margaret Sullivan showed us. And that's what Johnny Cash gave us, the reminder that music isn't just entertainment, that art isn't just decoration, that words aren't just sounds we make. They're how we survive. They're how we remember. They're how we love each other across any distance, and that in the end is everything.